Hey there, this is Adam again, and today we're gonna be talking about serverless because it's probably one of the best concepts about the cloud, managing the code without managing the servers or the infrastructure and everything at scale. Well, what's not to like it? Today we're gonna get introduction into Azure Function Apps, probably one of my favorite services, so stay tuned. So let's start with functions. Functions is a service for running small pieces of code. So you have that script in .NET or maybe Java or any other languages that is supported. This is the place to go. And they call those small pieces of code functions. This is a great service, a very cheap service, very scalable service for running serverless because you don't have to manage infrastructure underneath. What is important is that this service is an extension of Azure App Service. So if you want to know all about features that this service has because this is an extension of the app service, I highly recommend you to watch the video on the app service, which will be linked down in the comments. So why would you use function apps? Well, they have a lot of features like multiple languages. They support C# in both .NET and .NET Core frameworks, Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, which is transpiled to JavaScript. You have PowerShell core. You have F# and Python, so a lot of languages that you can use and that are popular recent days, you can use here. But additionally, you can pay per use, so the price is super cheap because first 400,000 gigabytes of memory is free, as well as first million executions are also free. So you probably will use functions in most cases without paying a dime. So I would say that's a great price. But if you extend and you go further beyond that, the price is still very small because million executions cost 169 cents. Additionally, you have your own dependencies that you can bring either using npm or NuGet. You also have integrated security. This is coming from the app service. You have this integration with Azure Active Directory or any other external provider. You have simplified integration because you can combine this with external tools. You have flexible development because you can develop in the portal or maybe Visual Studio Code or any other tool in that matter. But also you have integration with GitHub, Azure DevOps and other external repositories. And this is again one of the key features that came from this being an extension to the app service. And lastly, we have this as an open source because entire SDK for functions is open source, so you can find it on a GitHub. So we were talking about this simplified integration. I didn't say much because I have a lot of slides on the simplified integration. And let's talk about this now. So how function works. Function is a piece of code, we already said that, but in order to execute that piece of code, you need something called trigger. A trigger is an action that will involve this code and will pass some basic information to this code in order to run. And of course, code, when it's done, it has some sort of an output, because why would you run it if it didn't have an output? So the simplified integration is this part where binding to triggers, inputs and outputs is very simple. For instance, you can bind to a blob storage, so you can trigger a code whenever there's a new file available on a blob, and you can maybe process that file and put it back on a blob storage. What is great here is that you are not limited to one trigger and one output. Trigger can only be one. There's always one trigger, but you can also have multiple inputs. So you can maybe grab additional data from your Cosmos DB while processing this blob storage, or maybe you can grab some additional info from the QStore. And this is not where it ends, because you can also have multiple outputs. So maybe you process this file, you grab some information from the queue, now you can also output this to the blob storage, maybe save some additional logging into another blob storage, and put some events for other applications to know that you're finished processing on the event hub. So all those integrations are very easy, and I will show you why. So let's grab the most simple example. So we're processing data from the blob storage and we want to output into the blob storage. How do we do this? I will use .NET Core as an example, but it's as easy in any other language as it's .NET Core. You just grab the documentation and check what's the difference. But the principle stays the same. So this is the piece of code that grabs the file from the blob as a trigger. So you have a blob trigger defined here, and you do it in a way that you pass a parameter and you specify blob trigger. That tells our function that we are triggering every time there's going to be a new file on the blob storage. Second of all, you specify in which container should you check. In this case, it's going to be sample work items. So function will check whenever there are new files in this container and trigger whenever new file appears or is modified. Next, you have something called expressions. So in this case, you use expression to grab the name of the file that is being processed. What is good here is that you can use this expression to pass the name of that file into a variable of the same name. That means in this name variable right now, in this parameter, you will have the name of the file or actual full path to the name in that variable. Next and lastly, for this trigger, you need to define the variable that you will put your contents of the file in. In this case, it's a stream, so we're gonna put the file and all its contents into my blob parameter. And lastly, if you want this output, you just add additional line saying blob. This is no longer a trigger, so it's just a blob. You specify the container name, you specify the file access, which is in this case writing because we're processing the file. And you can just type a blob, copy to output blob, and this is with one line of code, you're making a copy of blob into additional container, into additional storage. This is as easy as you see. You just type in one binding, because this line that you see here, blob trigger, blob, those are bindings. So you just give one line of binding and just type your code, and it does all the connectivity, all the file uploading, downloading, all those kind of actions for you. And it's as easy as it gets for any other binding, for any other service. So if this is so easy, what kind of triggers and bindings do you have available at hand? There's quite a lot of those. I will show you the brief list. So first of all, look at this list and notice that there's first of all two versions of the function apps, version 0.1 and version 0.2. I would say go for version 0.2 because it's the direction that Microsoft is going, and it's probably gonna be long-term living support here, much longer than a version first. And there's a lot of new features coming in 2.0 that are not available in 0.1. But also notice that all those services not always can be also input and output because of how those services work. Best example of this is event grid on the left hand side, because it can be a trigger, but it cannot be output or input. So you can trigger your functions based on the events from the event grid, but you cannot output into the event grid yet. So you have, of course, blob storage, Cosmos DB, event grid, event hubs, HTTP and webhooks. Those are standard. This is not a service binding. This is just a binding for you to create your HTTP RESTful services. You also have integrations with Graph. Graph is a crazy good API delivered by Microsoft to manage all things about Office and Azure Active Directory. So you have Excel tables, OneDrive files, Outlook email, some events from the graph. You have tokens, but also you have mobile app service, you have notification hubs, queue storage, SendGrid, service bus, signal error, table storage, timer, which means you can actually do schedule processing, and Twilio. So a lot of bindings for you to use and a lot of flexibility coming with them. So let's go into the portal and start creating the service. In order to create new service, you need to hit create resource and type function. Hit create. You need to provide the name. I'm gonna call it A4E demo app. I need to select a resource group. I already have one existing, so I'm gonna choose that. I'm gonna leave OS as Windows. I'm gonna leave consumption plan. Consumption plan is this serverless plan, which means you don't manage any servers. Azure will give you servers whenever there's a processing happening. Whenever there's not, it will take away those servers. So you have between 0 and 200 servers available at hand. And of course, Azure decides whenever you need those 200 servers or not. If you're gonna be processing a lot of data, Azure will keep giving you additional servers and your data will be processed faster. Next, we need to pick a location. I'm gonna pick North Europe. This is my go-to choice because it's the closest data center of me. I'm gonna choose runtime stack .NET Core. I'm gonna choose storage. Interesting, why do I need a storage? Because everything that you do in functions, including functions code, is stored on a storage. As you can imagine, since functions are serverless, you don't have a server, therefore you don't have any place where you can put your code in and save your state. This is where storage comes in. Entire code base of your functions and the state of your functions are saved on the storage, so whenever new servers are initialized, they grab the code from the storage. And lastly, you have Application Insights, a great service for logging and telemetry, but this is not a part of the demo today. So let's hit create. The deployment happens in about 2-3 minutes because 3 services needs to be deployed, so I'm gonna speed this up. So the deployment finished, so we can go to our resource group, open it, find the function app, including the storage that we created and application insights. I'm gonna go to app service, and this is the default UI that you will be presented in that when you create functions. So let's go back to our presentation and I will talk briefly about the features that you can find here in the portal. So what are the top features? First of all, when you are presented with this, you will have a list of the function apps, and for each function app, you will have an overview tab and a platform features tab. In an overview tab, you have a most basic information about the function app, like the URL of the function app, what is the pricing tier and app service plan, what is the resource group that it is hosted, what is the current status, which in our case it's running. But you also have something important in the platform features, because in the platform features you have much more options, like all the options coming from the app service, but also one key feature here is the function app settings. I'm not going to talk about all those options here because they are coming from the app service. If you want to learn more about most of them, go to my video on the app service. But for today, we're just focusing on this one, function app settings. So in the function app settings, you will get the most basic information about the, let's say, crucial part of the environment setting. Like daily quota is here, the runtime configuration, which is this 1.0, 2.0 version that we're talking about when we are talking about the bindings. You also have read-only mode here, that if you want to change your application that no one can modify it. You also have your host JSON file here, but I will talk about host JSON file later on. Additionally, when you have functions already deployed, in the functions tab you can find all those functions, you can change the state of each function, you can either disable it or enable it. You can create new functions from here. Of course, this is not the professional way of developing functions, but you can in fact develop functions in a portal. This is great for quick prototyping, but still, considering how fast it is to deploy it from Visual Studio, I would never use Portal anyway. So when you hit new function, you will be presented with the templates for this function. You have HTTP templates, you have timer templates, service bus, queues, and a lot of more. You just hit one of those, provide some basic information, and you will get the function like this. So HTTP trigger function, when you deploy it, you will see something like this. This is the out-of-the-box template using CSX, which is like scripting C# file. I would say it's not the best to develop production applications, but it's good for every now and then. And of course, you have an additional tab called test, so you can quickly test your functions also in the browser. So it's like a small integration development environment for you in the browser to do a quick POCs, quick testing, and quick functions. Next, in this function inside of it, you have 3 tabs called integrate. This is a visual way to add those bindings that we were talking about. You have a trigger here, you can add inputs, multiple inputs or multiple outputs, and for each you can provide a configuration. For instance, when hitting on the input, you will get a list of the standard input that you can use, like a blob storage, table storage, authentication tokens from graph, etc. Next, you have a manage section. In the manage section, you can manage keys. What are the keys for the functions? When you create a function and you had this function code that we are showing, at the top you had a get function URL button. When you hit it, you would see something like this with the URL to your function. But what you wouldn't see at first, there's a very long code attached to your function. This is authorization code that allows you to call this through the public internet. And you have also monitor tab, in which you can see all the executions for your functions. This is a very, very small, very basic feature. It's just a date, operation ID, duration, code. But if you want to see full telemetry for your data, you just go to Application Insights, since we provisioned this together. And that's it in terms of portal features. But one last thing that I want to talk about is this host configuration file, because this host file that we're talking about in the function app settings is the file that controls how your entire functions work. For instance, one of the sections that you can apply there is HTTP section. This is the section that will control how your HTTP trigger works. First of all, it defines the route. It says that the prefix for the route is always /API, which is good to always notify your customers and your clients that this is the URL for the API. You also have max outstanding request count. This is how many requests can there be queued before your requests will start getting responses too busy from the service. And also you have max concurrent requests, and this is the count of how many parallel executions for the functions can happen at the time. In this case, it's 100, which means we can have 100 functions running at the same time. So let's go further and talk about this file. But remember, this file is available in the function app settings. If you're working in the portal, this is the place where you change it. But if you're working with a code, then this is going to be part of your code base in your project. So let's go back to the portal. Since we've seen how to work with this, let's create a quick function. So let's go to the function tab. Let's hit this button to create new function. From the quick start, we're gonna choose that we want to develop in the portal. I'm gonna hit continue. I want to create a webhook plus API, which is this HTTP trigger. So I'm gonna hit create. And in just a couple of seconds, I'm gonna be presented with a standard template for HTTP triggers. Okay, I've got it. And notice that it is tiny bit different than what we were talking about, because you have here HTTP request, it's not HTTP trigger. And this is simply because working with HTTP is tiny bit different than working with other triggers. But don't worry about it. This is the most simple version of the HTTP function that you can write. So you have some logging here that we've been processing a request. This says that grab the URL parameter called name. If there's some parsing, and if there's no name in the URL, return the message that URL needs to be submitted. If it is, say hello and the name. So let's see if this works. You can test it two ways. You can either open this panel on the right hand side, click on the test tab, and send a request body or a URL parameter. Scroll down, this UI is not the best, but there's a run button here. Execute it. And we got hello Azure, so it works. But you can also test it just by grabbing the URL yourself, going to another tab, pasting the URL, hitting enter. Of course, please pass the name query string. We didn't do that. So let's do that. So my name is Adam. And hello Adam. So as you see, it works. And we got logs here, we got console, everything that we do we can see here quickly at glance. So of course you could stay here and start developing here, and notice how it is to actually create your HTTP type functions. But let's be professional. So let's go and create function called using Visual Studio Code. So how you do that? First of all, you go to your Visual Studio Code, make sure that you are logged in and you have extensions called Azure Account and Azure Functions installed, including all the CLI tools for the functions. When you do, you log into your functions and your portal, and in your subscription you should be able to find the function that you created. Let's refresh. So we have our A4E demo application. This is all the functions that I have access to. So what we need to do right now is go to Explorer. This is the empty demo folder that I created, and we need to initialize new project. I do that by hitting F1 and typing functions. So you have an extension installed, you will see all those options here. I will hit create function option. It says that I need to initialize the project, which I'm gonna say okay. I want to use C# because today's demo is part of the .NET Core. I want to trigger, let's maybe do a scenario where we're gonna trigger from the blob. We're gonna process this blob and output it back into the storage. So I'm gonna hit blob trigger. Well, the name is not the best, but let's change it. Process my blob. So let's process my blob. What is the namespace? I'm just gonna leave it as default. Create local app settings JSON. I'm gonna use this storage. I need to create a what is the container name? I'm gonna call it demo. And for local development, you need to select if you're using live storage account from Azure or if you're using local emulator. I'm just gonna choose local emulator because it's much better. And what to do with the file that we're gonna create? Open in current window. It was quite few options to click at start, but we're done. And let's see what the template created for us. First of all, you hit here enter. And here we see that we have 3 parameters for blob. So we have a connection name, we choose the connection, we have a demo. So let's talk about what do we have here. First of all, blob trigger, which means this function will run every time there's a new file. This file has to be on the demo container, on a storage that is supplied in this connection setting, and the name of the file will be passed into name parameter. So what we need to do here is, we probably could just deploy this right now. But what I want to do is, I want to actually remove this setting because I don't want to create new storage account. I want to use this setting, use Azure Web Job Storage. So you can quickly change that by changing this connection name here. So that means we're gonna connect to blob, but how to connect to this blob? We're gonna use connection specified by app setting called Azure Web Job Storage. If you want to talk about and hear about the app settings, go again to the video on the app service plan and app service in general, and you will see how this binding is done, because this is also one of the features coming from the app service. So we're gonna grab this connection string, which means in the local development, we're gonna use local storage. In the portal, we're gonna use the storage attached to our functions. So let's hit save here. Let's do one more thing. Let's do a demo where, since we're gonna be processing this file and we can already do something about it, like, I don't know, grab a length of this file, like var len equals this, right? So this is gonna grab the length of the file from our stream and put it in the length variable. So if we want to output something into blob again, we need to go here. The easiest is just copy this line and change a few things about it. So let's remove trigger, because this is no longer a trigger, it's gonna be output. Let's output something into different container. Maybe call that container output. Let's leave the name as the same as the name of the file we started processing. And let's change the variable to output blob. So what do we do right now? Let's do most simple example where I'm gonna grab my blob, type copy to, and let's copy it to output blob. One thing that we're missing here is file access, because for all the outputs and inputs besides the trigger, we need to specify what is the file access that we're accessing. In this case, we want to write to the blob, therefore we need file access write. This should be fine, and we should be able now to run this function. I can run it locally or quickly deploy this to Azure. So let's hit a command .NET build. After our function is built, we can quickly deploy this to Azure. I'm pretty confident this will work, so let's try it. We go to our Azure extension, we right-click on our application, click Deploy to Function App. It will say, if you are sure that we want to override existing functions, well, I am sure. So let's go for that. And the first deployment takes about a minute or two, so let's speed this up. Looks like we're done. If this works, we can probably go back to the portal and test it. I'm gonna open my storage account into the BLOB service. If you don't know storage accounts, I have a great video on storage account introduction that also will be linked down in the comment section, so feel free to check it out. For now, I'm gonna create two containers as we specified, one for the inputs, which is called demo, and one for the outputs called output. So if my function is working fine, I can go to demo, hit upload a file, select one of the files, maybe my file with my code, go back to the blobs, go to the output container, hit refresh, and then in just a couple of seconds, we're gonna get our file here. Even before I stop talking, we already processed our file, and I can open this file here and check that we have entire content of our file copied successfully to another container. It was this easy to bind two blobs, process something with them, and output back to the blob storage. And believe me, it's as easy to bind us to any other service that you've seen from the list that I presented previously. As you have seen, serverless is not that hard. You just type few lines of code and it's working. It's very cheap, very flexible, very scalable service that you can use in minutes. So if you know any of the programming languages, just go ahead and start doing it. It's very satisfying. If you like this video, hit thumbs up, leave a comment. And if you really like it, if you want to see more videos, hit subscribe, and I guess, see you next time.